This is our last lecture together. Once again, I appreciate your patience throughout this interesting semester. For you, I know it's been interesting in this class. For me, it's been very interesting in a variety of ways. But we have come to the last lecture that I want to give. And we've been unpacking this conception of the judicial power and separating the idea of judicial power as a construct of government and the conception of justice. We looked at justice a lot, quite extensively, as this theoretical assumption of equality, fairness, kind of abstract, but that really kind of depends on which ethical system you build it upon. And then we look at something that it manifests in government called the judicial branch. And that's something that we really started diving into over the last couple of weeks. This last lecture that I want to give really looks at crime and criminality. A lot of research, a lot of attention. Frankly, a lot of really bad narratives overwhelmingly kind of manifest within our society about crime and criminality, what it all means, and what undertones are necessarily true because of the data we see. And so what I want to do in this last lecture is I want to look at what do we see in the data, what can we reasonably conclude from that data, and then ultimately where do we go if we're going to perfect the judicial system, if we're going to create a more perfect judicial system, if we're actually going to address some of the issues that need to be addressed. It means that we're going to have to begin by having a better conversation about just what the issue is. And so we're going to have some tough conversations. We're going to look at whether or not the criminal justice system is biased. I'm going to argue that it is, in fact, biased. However, I'm going to argue that it's not biased in the way most people think it is, that there is an overwhelming bias that does seem to present itself, but it's one that we don't talk about. So as we get into crime and criminality, we're going to unpack many layers of thought as we walk through this today. And so, again, bear with me through the recorded lecture, I know, but hopefully you'll find some nuggets to kind of digest here, right? So the first thing we have to kind of keep in mind is that there has been in recent history a spike of crime and criminality throughout the United States. This is not new. This is not unique to Texas. We see this in most of your major cities. If you look right here, California and Texas actually went through a very similar kind of trend line. And when you start looking at this, this is prisoners held in Texas and other large states, 1950 to the present. And so a lot of things on this are going to be attached to, well, this is because of the quote-unquote war on drugs. The war on drugs is the number one criticized issue for this kind of rise in crime and criminality that goes from the 70s all the way into the early 2000s. And that's problematic for a lot of different things, because a lot of times when the federal government and federal politicians talk about crime and criminality, they are talking about federal prisons. Federal prisons only make up about 5% of all crime and criminality. When you start looking at state prisons, state jails, we begin to see a very different narrative emerge, and that narrative actually applies to 95% of other crime and criminality in the United States. And so when we start talking about the war on drugs, that war on drugs applies to this 5% leaving this 95% somewhat unaccounted for. And so even though we kind of have this narrative going around that, oh, we can just blame the war on drug, that doesn't really explain why we see a spike during the 1980s and why we see a leveling off in the 2000s. It really just doesn't. And so we're still trying to puzzle this together, trying to figure out why do we see a rise in crime and what do we do about it and how do we resolve this kind of spike in crime, because we do see that crime tends to be cyclical and crime tends to be generational, and these are issues that we really kind of haven't compensated. And so we have to kind of take a tough look at this one. So when we look at issues of rape, murder, and robbery, we saw all of them kind of on the increase. And so when we're looking at this element, we see this one. So this is taking on state and federal prison population from 1925 to 2017. Once again, we see a relatively stagnant prison population, and then somewhere in here, everything just kind of spikes. And so maybe this is a war on drugs, maybe this is something attached to drugs, but like I said, we haven't narrowed this down as effectively as many people think we have. A lot of people just want to blame the war on drugs, but that doesn't really tell the whole story. The other thing we kind of have that's often kind of put out in the news is that the U.S. leads the world in the number of incarcerated rates per 100,000. Now, this is technically true. The U.S. imprisons more people per capita, that means as compared to our population, than any other country on the planet. But to be fair, in Russia, you don't always go to prison. In Rwanda, you rarely go to prison. In Brazil, you rarely go to prison. So when we start looking at some of these things, some of these are probably much higher on these civil rights violations. And we look at overall civil rights and crime and criminality, we see them being far more egregious. So what we're seeing in the United States is somewhat of a misnomer for saying, oh, the United States is worse off than Russia. And I would hesitate to make that conclusion. But if we do compare the United States with other civilized areas that would be comparable, like Australia, like Canada, we do see abnormally high rates of incarceration. And part of this is because of the American philosophy that was built based on a broken door theory that said we need to be tough on crime. This idea of we need to really take on crime, and if we're harsh on early crime or little crimes, then we'll actually prevent longer crimes. And what this was, it was a theory that came really in the 1980s, 1990s. It was based on a psychological profile called the broken window theory. And the idea was this, that we did an experiment and we put a car in the middle of a low-income neighborhood, and we wanted to see how long that car would sit before it really was violated or vandaled. And so we saw it there, and it sat there, and nobody touched it. It sat there, and nobody touched it. We sat there, and nobody touched it. And then one of the experimenters came through and broke one of the glasses, right? Just the broken window, that's it. And almost immediately following the broken window, within hours, the car was pillaged and vandaled and almost reduced to just a mere body of a car. And this led people to believe that, well, we can keep good so long as we don't have all of these minor infractions. As long as we really crack down on the broken window, pun intended, right, we can prevent these kind of crimes. And this idea, this theory really kind of manifests in the 80s and 90s. So when we start looking at this number of incarcerated rate and we see this spike, we want to say, well, this was just because of the war on drugs. And like I said, if all of these are drug-related crimes, then maybe we have an argument for there. But if they're not drug-related crimes, then maybe there's some other argument we have to look for. Maybe the argument here comes into a psychological argument that we kind of generally accepted as a society, and maybe that argument was not a good argument. But this would require that we rethink some of our ideas about crime, about criminality, and about how we go about reforming those that commit crimes. All right. So when we look at inmate age, here's one of the things we need to do. The common data out there suggests that your average prisoner is a young black male, right? That's kind of what we see. And usually they're in prison because of some drug-related crime. So that's the first kind of myth we have to debunk. Do we really see, number one, a young African-American male? Is that kind of the normal kind of run-of-the-mill prisoner? The first thing we see is no, the young is not the case, right? Average age 36, the most common ages range from 31 to 46. So we're actually looking at middle-aged population. The inmate population across the United States is actually far older than many people believe it is. And once you've spent a certain number of years in prison, the odds of you staying in prison or going back to prison astronomically go up. So once again, this kind of broken window theory, one of the elements of being tough on crime is we wanted to give tough or longer sentences. One of the things we've seen as a byproduct of that is because of the longer sentences, we've seen a higher rate of what we call recidivism, which is a return to prison even after parole or after release. And so what we're seeing in the prison population is an astronomically older prison population than a lot of people actually understood. Here is one of the biggest things that we see, right? When we look at drug offenses, if I look at the number of federal crimes, right? If I look at kind of federal data on this, then I'm looking at number of inmates here. I can look at for all these different things, and I look at drug offenses here, and I see, wow, 74,000 drug offenses. That makes up 45% of all inmates in prison. The problem with this analysis, and this analysis is done a lot, is this accounts only for federal prisons, right? Remember, federal prison accounts for only roughly 5% of those in prison or jail across the United States. So this is a very small piece of the pie, and this pie shows us federal crimes, right? Federal violations, federal infraction. This goes up there with like white collar crime, tax evasion, terrorism, stuff like that, right? When I actually began looking at the broader picture beyond this kind of element, I see this kind of small percentage here of those that are actually in prison for federal government, and notice that a little bit different there, but very similar number because we're looking at different years, right? But that number makes up a small percentage of the overall number of people in jails and prisons throughout the United States. And so I'm left with a conundrum, right? The number one, if I'm looking at that data here, why do I see so many people in the media, in the news, in my class cite this data when this data only applies to a very small number of those actually in prison and jails? We have to do better research, right? And so we begin looking at state prisons and local jails and looking at the bigger picture of the United States. And this is actually a really good website to use, the Prison Policy Initiative. This is an issue near and dear to my heart. Prison reform is one of the things that I do not think it's enough love. It does not get enough attention, primarily because we in the United States, once we lock somebody away, we kind of forget about them. And you don't win a lot of brownie points by running a campaign that says we need to be more humane for the prisoners and the people locked up. That doesn't win you a lot of votes. Telling people like, no, they're bad and scum and get them off the street, that wins you votes. And so we really have this underbelly of what I would consider a really, really bad system. But since nobody really pays attention to it, we have a lot of bad narratives that lead to bad policies that then cause the very things that we say we're trying to prevent. So we have to, as students of government, go back and look at the bigger picture. And the first thing that we see in the bigger picture is that overwhelmingly the biggest percentage of those incarcerated are held at the state level and at the local level. In other words, county level jails, state level jails, that's really where we're seeing the prison population. The other thing we notice is this: overwhelmingly, right, we're seeing a huge element of violent crime, right? Notice the number cited here for federal drug federal drug convictions is 81,000. Almost 10 times as many of that is in a state prison for some type of violent crime. And yet we are told at home by federal politicians that the only reason we're seeing such a ballooning of these prison populations is because of drugs. This is because of the war on drugs. This is because of the federal war on drugs. That narrative simply is not true. Now, that narrative may be true here in this very small percentage of what we consider federal prisons and jails. But when we look at the broader narrative of really this ballooning element, right, we're seeing something else is going on in the United States that we're simply not paying attention to, right? After violent crime, we have property. Drug then come in next. So we're looking at roughly 200,000 drug-related convictions at the state level, right? Public order comes after that. And so when we start looking at these and, all of these innocent people that are in prison just for drug, look at these. We're looking at more than that. Almost the same number of drug convictions are murder convictions, right? We add that to manslaughter, right? Rape and sexual assault, right? Robbery, more assault, right? Property damage, right? Theft, burglary, fraud, all of these compose a bigger percentage than what we're seeing with the drug-related elements. And so when you look at local jails as well, once again, violent crime makes up the biggest one, property crimes are next, drugs are third on the list. And so when we start looking at the bigger picture requires us to take a more sober look at the overall situation of crime and criminality in the United States. And I think this more sober look is one we must look at. So prison population by offense, this is taken from 2014. Again, you can look up any data from any year you want to. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice actually has these statistics. They're regularly published. You can look at these. In government, we say that this is all hiding in plain sight. It doesn't matter how many politicians tell a lie. It's like this data is still out there, but we know that nobody really is going to pay attention to look at it because, well, it means you'd have to do research and do things. And so you, as a student of government, you will be able to embark with more information simply because you've gone through my class. All right, good for you. So if we look at this, once again, those in the prison population in Texas, this is reducing it just for Texas. We're seeing 61% violent crimes, right? We're seeing the secondary rate, 13.9% drugs, 12.9% property crimes, and other crimes composing 13%. So when we see this type of, what do we see in Texas if we narrow it down? Once again, we're seeing a large preponderance of violent crime. And so this idea that we're seeing young men in prison primarily for drug-related crimes, that's just not accurate, right? Most of those narratives are easily broken down with even an ounce of attention to the actual data. So when we start breaking down the data further, right, we're going to take on a couple of things. If I begin looking at this violent crime, property crime, and drug crime, and I begin looking at all this in total, once again, I see in the data, right, the same kind of stats, right? I see a bigger percentage of violent crime when I look at the total on hand. So this is not just the number of convictions. These are the total on hand that's either they're waiting to be transitioned in a way, they're being held in a way. And so we have the total kind of in the care of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, and we see even these in the care of still follow this narrative that it's primarily violent crime that we're wrapping our heads around. In other words, we've seen an increase in violence and a crackdown, if you will, on violent crime. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind. So what about race and gender? Race and gender comes a lot up. And, well, I say race and gender. Race comes up a lot. Gender is often ignored. We often really don't look at gender in the criminal justice system unless we're looking at the ratio of male judges to female judges. And then we talk a lot about the feminist narrative that, the glass ceiling for women, they have to break into judgeships. And so there is a feminist argument that is being made that women have been cut out of judgeships. But when you actually look at the manifestation of how we treat crime and criminality in the United States, it really is who suffers the consequence of a poor system. We can have the argument for judges and justices and a male dominance of the judges. I think that's a separate argument. When we're really looking at the crackdown of crime, these bad policies, if we call them, what are they really cracking down on? Who are they cracking down on, and who's being hurt? If I begin unpacking the prison population, the first thing I see is people say, well, it's overwhelmingly racist, because if I break it down in your top racial groups, then what I end up having is roughly equal percentages of every group, right? Okay, fair enough. We'll look at that argument. Because first off, if I argue this, the first thing you have to argue is true is that you have to say that crime and criminality should be roughly equal based on racial demographics, right? So you have to argue this first and foremost, right? So in order to say that if we had a fair or just system, if we only have 14% African American, we should only have 14% of convicted African American. That there always should be a proportional element to the number of conviction, which would reduce crime to kind of like a lottery system that was proportionally kind of delved out based on these generic factors like race. In my humble estimation, that's one of the most racist arguments you can make, to suggest that somebody is predisposed to crime proportionally based on birth, right? That argument in and of itself breaks down. And if you can't argue that it should be proportional based on race, then you really kind of throw out the argument that this is racist, because what we're seeing is this is roughly 1/3 of every prison population is of each one. So people say, well, that's about equal. But if the African American population only makes up 13 to 14% of the population, then people argue this is an overrepresentation of that 13 to 14%. But like I said, you can only make that argument if you base it upon this idea that it should be equal, that it should be proportional, that all crime and criminality is kind of delved out proportionally at birth, kind of equal by race. And again, I think this is a really bad way to look at crime and criminality, right? However, the other big argument that's staring us in the face here, beyond that of race that's often made, is the other argument. If I look at the male population, the total male population on hand, I'm looking at 124, 130, 133,000. So if I'm looking at just 133,000 here in Texas, this is on hand by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Meanwhile, I'm looking at like 12,000 women. Riddle me this. If men make up 49% of the total population of the United States and women make up 51% of the total population of the United States, and because the system is racist by virtue of this argument, and racial components should be proportional, therefore should gender also be proportional based on crime and criminality. If all of those arguments line up, in other words, if I apply a proportional argument to race, then let's apply it to gender. If men make up, right, 92, 93% of those in the prison population today, but only make up 49% of those in our population, how are we not raging against the system in an argument that the system is necessarily biased and prejudiced against men? How are we not saying that women get off easy, that women have an obvious privilege when it comes to crime and criminality, that they serve lesser times, they're convicted less often, they get lesser sentences when they go in. Oh, and by the way, if it's proportional, then 51% of the prison population should, based on the proportional argument made for racism, right, should be women. And yet it's not, and nobody seems to be bringing that up, right? Again, I'm not creating new arguments here. All I'm saying is, if we take the argument that we make for race, take the base of that argument and apply it to gender, it is far more obvious, right, that the criminal justice system would be gender biased, not racially biased, right? In other words, men suffer the really hammer stroke of the criminal justice system, right? This is problematic because in a nation today where we argue male privilege and men get away with everything, the data and the stats simply don't show that to be true. In other words, I could reasonably argue that there's a lot more men damaged by bad policies in prison than there are making millions of billions of dollars because they had this privileged white male existence on the way up. Right? We want to look at the privilege on one end of it, but are we actually paying attention to the bias on the other end as well? If I look at another way, right, who's in prison in the Texas population? Once again, right, I can look at this, 44% white, but they make up 31% of the population. Therefore, this is a drop, an underrepresentation. The Latino population makes up 39%, but only 30% of those in prison. Meanwhile, African Americans make up 13% of the population, but 35% of those in prison are African American. And I have talked to many, many, many groups and individuals says this is clear evidence of racism. Overwhelmingly clear evidence because of this overrepresentation, right? This is clearly indicative of a racially biased system. I always retort, then answer me this. Why is it that women make up 51% of the population as women, but they only make up about 8% of those in prison or the prison population? So if we're going to apply that argument here, then why would we not also apply it here? Again, logical consistencies really do begin telling us a different story on our overwhelmingly national hypocrisy and our ability to pick and choose arguments, right? This is just the number of prison population inmates per 100,000. We see this pretty kind of standard throughout the United States. The bigger states, more populated states tend to have more per capita. The smaller states tend to have less per capita. And again, the smaller states, a reasonable argue there is they're more spread out. Crime isn't overwhelmingly reported as such, and so there's a lot of different reasons we may see this. And so there's things. So if I look at this is taken from the Sentencing Project. And what we're saying here is that the lifetime likeliness of you being imprisoned or in jail, right, by anything else. So if you're looking at a black man, right, once again, is the system, right, somewhat biased in race? I would argue yes. The most obvious person that's likely to spend the greatest amount of time in prison is a black man. If you're a black man, you have a 1 in 3 chance of taking some time in jail or prison over your life. If you're a Latino, that number drops to 1 in 6. If you're a white man, 1 in 17, right? So men overall have a 1 in 9 chance of spending some time of their life in prison or jail, right? Compare that to women. Women have a 1 in 56 chance. If you're a man, look at the difference. Look at the ratio on how many more times likely you are to spend some time in jail or prison if you're a dude than you are if you're a woman. Right? If you're a white woman, right, there's your privilege. I know. You can send me letters of frustration and everything else, right? We want to look at the top. We want to look at the privilege when it benefits us, but we also have to look at the bottom and when bad policies hurt people. And right now, the criminal justice system, it's not hurting a bunch of white women to the same rate that it's hurting a bunch of men. When we look at black women, 1 in 18. Now, why is this important? This number right here, 1 in 18. Why? Because this number actually is less of a chance of spending time in jail or prison than a white male. In other words, a white male is more likely to spend time in prison or jail than a black woman is, which means if we're honest with ourselves, the criminal justice system is more biased against men of any color than it is against women of any color. The gender bias is overwhelmingly more prevalent and more obvious than the racial bias, right? Now, I'm not saying the racial bias doesn't exist. I'm simply saying the gender bias is far more obvious and far more easy to point out in the data, and yet nobody seems to be talking about it, right? So when we start looking at this and putting it together, this is where we started the unit, right? It says the difference between civil law and criminal law turns on the difference between the two different objects. So if I'm going to look at crime and criminality, I'm trying to figure out what am I doing with crime and criminality? What's the point of criminal law, right? So civil law, I want to redress, I want to make things right, I want to prevent this ongoing feud. But what about criminal law? It says, on the other hand, in the case of crimes, the main object of the law is to punish the wrongdoer, to give him and others a strong inducement not to commit the same or similar crimes, to reform him if possible, and perhaps to satisfy the public sense that wrongdoing ought to be met with retribution. In other words, there's an idea in the law that our criminal law should, right, provide a strong inducement not to commit the same or similar crimes, right? And it should also seek to reform the individual, right? This is something as a parent that I've really taken near dear to my heart. If I pick a punishment for my kids and that punishment does not lead to a decrease in the behavior I'm trying to stop, then the punishment's a bad punishment, right? If the punishment does not reform or redeem the individual, then it's not a good punishment. Too often, we simply look at the criminal justice system and say, well, they're locked away, they're monsters, they're outside of us, they're unredeemable, right? And yet, if we begin to add a little bit of humanity to this and say, well, how could we create a system that is humane and looks at these individuals as redeemable, right? That would be a much different system than this, tough on crime, beat them up tough, you're at harsh penalties, you're at address the broken window theory. It means that a lot of the theories that we have accepted for the last 30 years about penalties and punishments simply have to be rethought, right? Even in schools, we have the zero tolerance schools, and we're going to go to schools and we're going to have zero tolerance. We're going to be very, very quick on kicking students out and having harsh punishments. Guys, what we found out is it didn't work. Right? It just didn't work. We actually saw an increase of the behavior that we were trying to stop. It didn't resolve the issues that we were trying to make it resolve. And if it's failing, it means we have to rethink the underlying assumptions upon which our narrative is based. Right? That's where we are today. That's where your generation is today. Your generation is really kind of beginning to unpack psychology and the human spirit and the human ability to say, is the human kind of being redeemable? Are we damned from birth, destined to be criminals, or is there always a core of redeemability within every human being? This is a big, messy question that we don't have a great answer for. But if we simply say, if you ever did anything wrong, we're just going to lock it up, throw away the key. If we continue to buy into the narrative that men are far more prone to crime and criminality than women are, right? Which completely negates actual science, by the way. Women are not as nice and caring as we want to believe they are, by the way, right? But nonetheless, that's a whole different lecture, right? It means if we want to develop a better criminal justice system, we have to develop a better understanding of the criminal. And that is something that we're not paying attention to. That's something I would say historically we have not paid attention to. So if I look at incarcerated people versus non-incarcerated people, I could say that, well, the reason they're incarcerated because they're black, right? I can make that argument. I can make the argument because they're male, all right? I can make that argument. But there's got to be a better argument out there. And I think one of the better arguments that I've seen is what happens if we look at the impacts of stress on individuals. Now, I am not justifying behavior. I'm not about to justify crime and criminality. I'm not about to justify why they made bad decisions or who was hurt in the process. What I'm trying to argue is if we begin to understand the foundational kind of elements that lead to criminal behavior, then it allows us to begin addressing the underlying causes instead of simply addressing the symptoms, right? In other words, instead of taking a pill for what's currently manifesting, actually trying to figure out what actually happened to cause that thing, right? So if we look at the curse of stress, right, on individuals, we know that stress, especially high levels of stress, causes individuals to do really poor decision making. And this is true of any age group, right? The other thing we see is not being able to pay your bills is a huge stressor. So what do we see in the data for incarcerated people, right? The number of incarcerated people, if I take the average income of the incarcerated people of all of them, right? Men that are incarcerated made on average when they went in about $19,000 a year. Non-incarcerated men made about $42,000. That's almost double the salary, right? Annual salary of men that are incarcerated. African-American men, same, right? Right? Again, lower overall. We can say that there's an element of racism playing into this. We can make those arguments, right? But that's not my intention. My intention is to make the more obvious argument, right? Hispanic, 19, 30,000. In every situation, we see a consistency in both men and women that you are more likely to be incarcerated the less money you make. Right? Now, does this mean we need to hand out money from the government? No, we have tried that and it hasn't worked. So simply handing out government reform programs, handing out paychecks to people, it doesn't work. We have to do better than that. There's an element where people need some kind of pride in their position. Like I said, we haven't figured this out. I'm not here to give you a lot of answers, but I'm here to try to press better questions, right? If I look at the distribution of income for incarcerated men prior to incarceration, once again, same data, just different source, because if I'm going to make this argument, I have to prove my argument. I have to give you reason to believe my argument. Once again, 57% of those in prison actually had an income of less than $22,000, right? Of non-incarcerated people, the highest percentage of non-incarcerated people made the largest amount of money. And we see this, right? I mean, just notice this data. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to prison. The more money you make, the less likely you are to go to prison, right? This remains true, right? And so with women, it becomes a little bit different. Now, women on the bottom end, incarcerated, overwhelmingly, the less money you make, the more likely you are to be incarcerated. We don't see it on the other side where we see the upward trajectory. But again, remember, women only make up about 8% of the prison population. So we could argue that this data is already skewed. However, for those people that are incarcerated, right, we simply do see that there is a correlation between the less money and larger rates of incarceration. We just see overall more women make less money. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. And again, that's a lot of feminist arguments are out there, very loud, very vocal, championing that argument on why women make money. I will let you go look at the data on that one. That's not my job today. My job is simply to look at the crime and criminality and what the criminal justice system is weighing heavily on, right? So once again, another way to look at this, there's a lot of different, I'm just going to leave this stats. You can pause this, whatnot, just unpack this. It's simply more data to look at what we have. And so I ran across this cartoon at some point It's taken from a British magazine because this is not unique to America. The Western civilization is trying to understand crime and criminality, and America's on the boats like everybody else. And so we have the prime minister. He says we're expanding prisons across the country, and the secretary here says, "Very good, Prime Minister. And what do you plan to do about housing for the poor and mentally ill?" I just told you, we're expanding prisons. What do we do with the poor and the mentally ill? I told you, we're expanding prisons. Right? We're on the eve of Christmas and reading Charles Dickens in class right here in Alaska. And one of the interesting things in the beginning of Charles Dickens is the fact that we have this element of Scrooge, and Scrooge's approach at the beginning of the book. He says, hey, Scrooge, we're trying to raise money for the poor and the destitute and the needy. These people that are downtrodden, they don't have enough money. And Scrooge immediately goes like, are the workhouses functioning? Are the prisons functioning? I mean, don't we have government services for the poor? I mean, isn't this what we do? We take, if they were smart, if they were intelligent, if they were industrious, they wouldn't be poor, they wouldn't be criminals, right? There's kind of like this bias that if they were right in their mind, they wouldn't be poor, and therefore they wouldn't be criminals. And the reality of the world is sometimes it's not that simple. So sometimes it doesn't work out that way. Sometimes really good people just can't get a break, and beyond these storylines and feel-good Christmas narratives, there is a continued kind of growing body of evidence that requires us to rethink some of our own bias towards crime and criminality, towards criminally accused individuals, and our tendency to look at the worst human beings and say, well, God, at least I'm better than that. Because there is kind of a perverse justification that we do because we almost perversely need them to exist so we can justify sometimes our lesser crimes. And there's an element of this in psychology that I think it centers at the bottom of all this that we kind of ignore. And so I'm going to end with one more study, and then I'm going to leave you alone because I know recorded lectures aren't fun. But this has came out in the new report. I want to read it to you, and I want you kind of leaving you in my class with something I try to accomplish in my class: a data-rich argument, something else to chew on, something else to talk about that may be beyond the political narratives that are often propagated out there or preponderate. I can't speak tonight, apparently. This one says, in a new report published today, we look at poverty across multiple dimensions for adults aged 25 to 61. Using a 2014 American Community Survey, we look at a particular differences in how different dimensions and different disadvantages overlap or cluster together for people of different racial categories. We find stark race gaps in the risk of overlapping disadvantages in 5 dimensions. So we're seeing stark race gaps, right? If we just look at crime and criminality, right, and we simply look at kind of like the racism in the criminal justice system, and we ignore the beginning point, the input. If we only look at the output, we're missing an argument. We're missing part of the narrative, right? So what do we see? We see these 5 things, and the 5 things they came up with were low household income, limited education, lack of health insurance, low income area. They live in a low income area, right? Which, yes, community poverty does impact. If you live around a bunch of poor people, then the odds of you ending up in jail and prison go up, even if you are a good person. It just does. Poor neighborhoods tend to get patrolled more often. They tend to get more shenanigans. They tend to end up in more criminal-like activity out in the streets and whatnot. And so even if you are not a criminal yourself, if you live in a predominantly impoverished areas, it does increase the pressure, right, of certain types of behavior. And so we look at that as well. The other one is whole household unemployment, the number of people in your house not working, which does matter, right? It's a lot better if people in your house are working, right? Point blank, it matters. You want people in the house working, right? So he goes on. He says almost half the U.S. population suffered from at least one of the 5 disadvantages. So of all 5, we had almost 50% of the United States suffered from at least one of these, right? So if we're looking at the United States population, overwhelmingly, right, everybody experiences almost one of these. However, the proportion suffering from many dimensions of the poverty is lower, but far from trivial. For instance, there are more than 3 million Black adults and 5 million Hispanic adults facing at least 3 disadvantages, right? So what I'm seeing is this, right? I'm seeing that, about 50% of the United States population experiences at least one, but specifically within Hispanic population and African American population, we see experiences of multiple of these, right? Multiple indications of low education, multiple indications of low household income combined with low education, combined with lack of health insurance, combined with the low income area. In other words, when I start stacking these disadvantages on each other, this dramatically increases the odds of all kinds of calamity later on in life, right? He says the conclusion of the study was most white adults don't suffer any of the 5 advantages. Most Hispanic and Black adults do. Only 38% of white adults face at least one disadvantage versus 70% of Hispanic and Black residents. Furthermore, among the white adults that do experience at least one disadvantage, most don't experience any additional disadvantages. By contrast, most Black and Hispanic adults with at least one disadvantage suffer at least one additional disadvantage, right? There are important differences between people of different racial categories. However, Black residents are more likely to live in poor area and or jobless family than Hispanics, who are more likely to lack high school and education and health insurance. In other words, this is what I'm going to leave you with, right? There is a strong connection between these 5 items and the likeliness of ending up in prison and jail. Right? Even if I control for gender and some of the other arguments we've already made, right? If I take on this, if I simply say the criminal justice system is racist, I miss the point. I'm only looking at the output. I actually have to begin looking at, okay, what is actually going on in those communities? And here's the problem. This is why it's such a difficult, conundrum to solve, because Black residents are actually suffering different issues than Hispanic residents are. Right? If I'm trying to kind of address Black community needs, I'm looking at community development and I'm looking at whole household joblessness. If I'm trying to develop Hispanic needs, I'm looking at lacking of high school education, the number of Hispanics without a basic GED or education, and I'm looking at health, right? Overall health care and health insurance of Hispanics. In other words, I've got different needs within different communities that need to be met. Those lacking of those needs compound the stress, which increase the likeliness of engaging in some type of criminal behavior, or at least getting caught in some type of questionable activity. And so when I begin looking at the data, right, maybe the answer to crime and criminality doesn't actually rest in this kind of beratement of cops for racial practices. That's only looking at the output, and that's a very bad narrative. What we have to begin looking at is a holistic argument on what actually leads to crime and criminality, what actually leads to the stressors that lead an individual to engage in violent crime, engage in rape, engage in murder, engage in violent assault, right? These are things that we don't have great answers for. Like, how could somebody be driven so destitute to accomplish some of the crimes that we're seeing people behind bars? If we simply continue to buy into the narrative that it's just young Black men that are behind bars because of minor drug offenses, then we miss the entire point and we buy into this really bad argument that it's just a racist system. If we begin allowing ourselves a bit of honesty and say that it's a lot more complicated than that, it's a lot more in-depth than that, and a lot of the arguments we're being fed are superficial political arguments, then we're forced to really have a better conversation. Again, this is taken from Brookings. If you look at all those who have at least one, right? Whites, majority of whites don't even experience one of them. However, Hispanics, 70% experience at least one. African Americans, 65% experience at least one. Experience at least two. Black and Hispanic, experience at least 3. Experience at least 4. When you're starting to look at maybe the answer to crime and criminality and social reform is not in attacking the system for the output. Maybe the issue is developing better policies to address some of these stressors in society, which gets into job creation, which gets into community development, which gets into housing for the poor, which gets into redeveloping our welfare system where it focuses on jobs and not handouts. That's a big argument that people aren't making. But we have to stop making bad arguments. We then have to look at better data, and then we have to begin discussing what is the right argument moving forward. Right. I appreciate your time, your patience. I know this has been, like I said, a fun, weird, awkward semester. I know for you, for me, very much so. That's why I have this Alaska State flag right here. My life has been interesting, as you can tell from the beard and everything else. But coming up next week, we'll have the biweekly 7 and 8 combined. It'll work as a final. Outside of that, all the other information's online. All the other assignments are online. So make sure you're looking at the syllabus, getting the work in that you need to do. Reach out to me in messages if you should have any questions, comments, or concerns coming down the line. I promise you, we'll get you through the rest of the semester with some dignity. We'll get you credit intact if you're willing to work with me. Other than that, I do hope you found something of value in the course. I wish you all the best, and I bid you all adieu.